Okay, so a bit of a different video, but today I'll be doing a review over the Sony A6300, which was my main workhorse camera for all of 2017 and a bit of 2016. Now there's plenty of reviews on the A6300, but my review is catered more towards shooting video as it pertains to YouTubers and especially sports videographers. And if you guys are considering picking up the Sony A6300, be sure to use my Amazon link in the description box below, as that link supports Mako Sports. I purchased my A6300 in August of 2016, which makes it a year and a half that I've had this camera. Now, before making this review, I went on and counted all of my videos, and since then, 147 of them were shot with the A6300. A little bit of a quick overview, this camera sits under $1,000 and offers a lot of great features like 4K picture profiles, an APS-C size sensor, slow motion 24 megapixel stills, and the list goes on. Now let's go ahead and step into the ergonomics and the build of the camera. Clearly the A6300 has a really small form factor. As you can see, the body itself has a really nice build. It's of a magnesium construction and it feels pretty solid. Now it's a small camera, so if you have really big hands, it probably won't feel comfortable to shoot with. And also the buttons are pretty small and sit really flush within the body, so that means pressing buttons isn't super easy, especially if you have gloves on. Now you can also fix this by purchasing button enhancers as well. So now that you've seen the camera uncaged, I'm going to show you what it normally looks like as I rig mine up pretty good for shooting video. Here I have a small rig cage, which is a solid chunk of aluminum. Gives you a whole bunch of extra mounting options, as well as it offers an extra layer of protection for the camera. I usually run a top panel that quickly attaches and detaches with a NATO rail. Also, sometimes I run this with a Tilta stop-start handle that makes shooting video with this camera feel more like a Sony FS5. You can also rotate this handle as it sits on a rosette mount, and you can start and stop recording with the button on top. Going into the peripherals, it has a nice bright EVF or electronic viewfinder, and since it is a mirrorless camera, which means you can actually use it when filming video, which you can't do with the DSLR. Now the LCD screen, however, is terrible. It is only a tilt screen, which for me isn't a big deal because normally I'm behind the camera and more often than not I'm running an external monitor with it. But if you don't have one of those and you need to see yourself like for vlogging, well, you just can't see yourself with the camera. However, the screen itself is small and doesn't have a very high pixel density, which makes it hard to manually focus if you don't punch in or use focus peaking. Also, when shooting 4K, it dims, which makes it really hard to film in bright sunlight. The camera also has a digital level, which is really nice. Simply, it lets you know if your shot is level, and it's a great feature if you're shooting video handheld. Okay, so stepping into video quality, the A6300 has an APS-C size sensor, which means it is smaller than full frame like on the A7S and A7R III. However, it is larger than the GH5 and GH4, as well as being slightly larger than the Canon DSLRs. Overall frame rates, you can shoot 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second, and you can shoot 1080p at 24, 30, 60, and 120 frames per second. The big thing with this camera is 4K. The 4K out of this camera is absolutely gorgeous. When you shoot 24 frames per second, the camera actually shoots 6K video in camera, full sensor readout, and then downscales that video into 4K, which in general just gives you sharper looking and more detailed 4K video. Now 4K at 30p has a slight crop, but I've only ever shot at 24 frames per second. Also, with regards to rolling shutter, since the camera is full sensor readout, at least in 4K, there is a pretty decent amount of rolling shutter, which isn't very good. So as you can see here, it's pretty bad. And also you can fix this when you're editing your video. If you do use Adobe Premiere like how I do, there's a fix called rolling shutter repair where you just drop that onto your clip and it should fix that. Usually it does the trick. Now this camera has some great slow motion features. It can shoot up to 120 frames per second in 1080p, which is awesome. It also does 60 frames per second as well. The 120 frames per second is a little soft, but I'd rather have it and it not be super sharp than just to not have it at all. The 120 frames per second is also continuous, which means you can shoot up to a 30-minute long clip and then simply decide what you want to slow down or put into slow motion when you're editing your video. Lowlight, the lowlight performance on the Sony A6300/A6500 is probably the best in class for all APS-C size sensors as it pertains to video. You can shoot at 3200 ISO and still get really clean, essentially noise-free results, and at 6400 you can get very usable results. Now it's rare that I need to shoot over 6400 ISO, but sometimes depending on the stadium lighting, time of day, as well as what lenses you're using, this can vary of course. Another really nice feature that the camera has is zebras, which is a really nice professional feature that puts a moving zebra-like pattern over the parts of your image that are blown out and have no more detail. Going into autofocus / manual focus, the autofocus on the A6300 is amazing. It's very similar to the Canon dual pixel autofocus systems on the newer Canon DSLRs like the 5D Mark IV and the 80D. And actually, I normally use it over manual focus because it is so good, especially if you're using native Sony lenses. For my autofocus settings, I usually run my AF drive speed on slow and then set my AF tracking sensitivity to high. And then when I'm filming lacrosse games from the sidelines, usually I will up that tracking sensitivity to fast or normal. And also, of course, you can shoot manual focus as well. This camera also has focus peaking built into the camera, which highlights your areas that are in focus. Picture profiles. The A6300 has a ton of different picture profiles that you can run through. Cine 2 and Cine 4 are the ones I normally use. These are flat and you can apply a simple grade and send them off, or you can spend a bit more time to develop a highly stylized look. Also, there are a ton more options that you can choose in camera to help stylize the look that you're really going for. The camera can also shoot in S-Log2 and S-Log3, which are super flat picture profiles that can actually expand your dynamic range. Definitely harder to grade than all the other profiles, and I rarely use these, but they are really nice to have, especially in really bright situations. I'd say the most dynamic range you can get out of the camera would be 12 stops, maybe 13 if you shoot in one of the S-Log profiles, which is actually excellent. Coming down to lenses, the A6300 comes with the Sony E-mount, which is great because it is the exact same lens mount as the full frame Sony A7 series, as well as the mid-tier video cameras like the FS5 and the FS7 Mark II. Now I have 3 native Sony lenses, the 18-105 f4, which is kind of my do-it-all workhorse, the 50mm 1.8 OSS, which I use a lot for photography and super low light stuff and when I'm trying to get like a really super shallow depth of field. And for filming highlights, I run the Sony 70-300 f4.5 to 5.6 G lens. Also, I'll say since the body of the A6300 is pretty small, it tends to feel a little bit unbalanced depending on which lenses you might have on it. So like with my 70-300, it does feel a little bit awkward to use because the lens is so big and the camera body is so small. Now, because you can adapt just about any lens ever made to Sony's E-mount, occasionally in the studio I run vintage lenses. Now I've built up a pretty big set as you can see, and some of my favorites are the Minolta 50mm 1.7, the Minolta 35mm 2.8, and then the Canon FD 135mm f2.8. Going into audio, the camera only has a 3.5mm mic and jack. The preamps are actually pretty good, relatively clean, and way better than any DSLR on the market. However, the camera doesn't have a headphone jack, so you can't really monitor your audio while recording video. Now, there are ways around this, but none of these are super fun solutions. And if you want to run like a professional XLR type microphone into the camera like this Sennheiser MKE600, you're going to need a preamp or an audio adapter. Here's a Beachcheck DXA Micro Pro that works pretty well for this sort of solution, and also it has a headphone jack as you can see. Now also there is a manual adjustment for making changes to your audio levels, and normally when I was shooting with this 6300 I was running the Rode VideoMic Go a lot with this camera. It's a great little microphone and then the two pair really well, both being really small in size. Now I'm going to be short on photography since I'm really a videographer, but the 6300 also does really nice stills, 24 megapixel stills at 14-bit RAW, and there are 3 JPEG options. Really my only use has been some basic sports photography and of course product photography, so here's just a couple shots from sports. Now, High Plus will give you 11 frames per second, which is insane. And then Standard High will give you 8 frames per second, which is great for sports photography as well. Going into usability, overheating is a possibility with the A6300 because it is such a small camera and it's doing, a number of things like downscaling 6K video. It has the potential to overheat if you shoot really long videos or in really hot situations. Sony has released some firmware updates to address this. Now, if you shoot short clips under 5 minutes in length like I do, then this shouldn't be an issue for you. Now, I've actually found this camera to be very reliable. I've been shooting with it over a year now I've shot MLL games in the rain and everything else in between. The most that's happened with it is it overheated once while I was filming a stringing tutorial. Battery life isn't very good. Usually for an MLL game, if I shoot everything at 120 frames per second, I can usually get away with just one battery. However, if you're shooting 4K, you're definitely going to need more batteries. Now, since January of 2018, my main shooter for videography is now the Sony PXW-Z90, but my A6300 still serves me for photography, low light videography, and for times when I'm going for a super shallow depth of field. It also makes for a great B camera as well in my current situation. So that's going to wrap it up for my Sony A6300 review. Market price for the camera without a lens is currently $900. With a lens, you're looking at just under $1,000. I think it's a great little camera if you're looking to start shooting and producing content in 4K. The camera is well worth the price considering the features that it has. Now, like I said earlier, I filmed exactly 147 videos with this, at least on the Mako Sports YouTube channel, and I found it to be an excellent camera overall. Personally, I believe it's a great jack of all trades camera if you need both stills and video, and I'd absolutely recommend it. So guys, if you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, be sure to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and thank you for watching.